So this is Dr. Woeller here for our first webinar installment for 2016. I hope everybody had a happy new year. And so tonight, this webinar, I've done this type of thing in the past, and maybe many of you know that I'm involved in these one-day intensive seminars for health practitioners with regards to the organic acids test and really learning how to interpret the test, apply it clinically in practice, different clinical scenarios that will come up. So this talk is an overview, from my viewpoint, why the organic acid test is such an important test to run if you are a healthcare practitioner for your patients, or perhaps you're an individual yourself looking to learn a little bit more about your health, or maybe you're a parent of an autistic child, why this test is so critical. So I'm going to go through some different reasons why that is, and we'll talk about some clinical scenarios as well. Okay, so reason number one of why to do the organic acid test has to do with understanding the invasiveness of Candida and be able to analyze the toxicity secondary to Candida. Now, if you've done an organic acid test before, you know that on page 1, particularly the top section of page 1, is specific to fungal markers in yeast. Now, if we orient ourselves here real quickly, the one that shows up most commonly with regards to Candida is arabinose, and that is an indicator, at least an indirect indicator, of invasive Candida as it starts to break down hyaluronic acid within the digestive system. And so we get a production of arabinose because of that. A few of the markers that are kind of interesting here, number 2 and number 4, when those show up, actually indicate the exposure to mold, most commonly Aspergillus, could be penicillium, but Aspergillus is certainly on that list. And in most common sources, it's from food exposure, whether it's moldy fruit or grains or cheese, sometimes environmental mold, so it might be mold damage in the home or a building somewhere, but that's usually what that indicates. And then periodically, you'll see this number 9 show up, tricarboxylic acid. And that actually comes from a fungus found on corn. So most of the time that tends to go away. When you repeat the test, you know whether it's 2-3 months later, and you've modified, your diet. So those are the most common ones that show up, but arabinose is very, very common. And so let's just talk about yeast here for a second, because yeast is a very complex organism, and much more complex than many of the bacteria that we deal with. And it all has to do with yeast's ability to invade the lining of the gut. And so we start off with what's called unicellular yeast, and then through changes in the microenvironment where yeast is living, some of it that it can control itself, changing the pH or changing the temperature, these types of things where yeast is, can induce the unicellular yeast to become more invasive, and that's where it develops into what's called this hypha formation. Starts to grow these tentacles, if you will. And you can see here this colony of yeast, and these things are growing these tentacles, and this is the invasive form as it starts to burrow itself into the cells that line the gut. Sometimes it gets in between the cells. It can break apart the tight junctions, leading to leaky gut. So it can do a host of things, but yeast has that ability to do so. Now, when we're picking up and when you're doing an organic acid test and we're evaluating or detecting the presence of arabinose, you can backtrack and realize that the arabinose is showing up because, in part, Candida is producing certain enzymes that are breaking down that intracellular cement. So it's essentially degrading certain functionality at the cellular level. And so we get an arabinose marker that shows up that indicates that. Now, tartaric acid can also show up too. It just doesn't show up as commonly. Probably of the two markers, arabinose is the one that shows up about 90 to 95% of the time. And then, of course, it can also, you have other immune factors that are involved in attacking yeast, and this is a whole topic in itself, and I've done webinars on the issue of yeast toxicity and the complexities of what yeast can do in the body. So arabinose we know is a big problem, and then arabinose itself can then start to interact with other things in the body. Arabinose can interact with lysine that then complexes with something called L-arginine to create these pentosodine chemicals. And pentosodines play a role as far as potentially triggering autoimmune reactions. They can cause protein disruption in the body. So there's a host of things that arabinose can do through the mechanism of pentosodine. And then just yeast itself, creating a lot of other havoc metabolically. One of the things that yeast can do, and also tartaric acid, is arabinose specifically and tartaric acid and other chemicals that get produced, is it can inhibit the functionality of the Krebs cycle. And essentially what that does is that disrupts mitochondrial function. So specifically tartaric acid, which is another byproduct of this invasive Candida, it'll inhibit this enzyme called fumarase. And fumarase is necessary to propel the Krebs cycle forward so that we're producing adequate amount of this chemical here called NADH. And NADH is then used in what's called the electron transport chain, another part of cellular function, to output large amounts of ATP, that cellular currency. So here we have an indicator that arabinose and the production of yeast toxins can inhibit the function of mitochondrial activity. Well, what happens when you inhibit mitochondria is you can compromise energy production of the body, you can compromise immune system, you can compromise musculoskeletal function, etc. The other thing that happens with yeast, and what can be detected off the organic acid test, and again, this has to be applied clinically, in a clinical situation, is that yeast itself can create byproducts that lead to a lot of behavioral problems. Now, whether this is in a child with autism, where they get goofy, giddy, silly, inappropriate laughter, so to speak, increased self-stimulatory behavior, or in an adult who maybe gets, emotional instability or headaches or sleeping problems, etc., that can also occur because of Candida. Because one of the things that yeast will do is it will take glucose, so it'll take sugar as its primary fuel source, and if you follow this chain reaction through these metabolic pathways, it outputs ethanol. It outputs alcohol. I just read an article recently about something called auto brewery syndrome. There was a woman who was pulled over for driving under the influence, and she swore that she had not drank any alcohol, and they did a breath test and found that her alcohol level essentially was elevated. But then through later analysis, it was determined that it was actually coming from her gut. She had this auto brewery syndrome, and a judge dropped the case. So people can harbor this dysbiotic condition in the gut, and through the overproduction of yeast toxins and bacteria as well, but yeast toxins primarily, produce ethanol. Well, we know that in autism, the children generally tend to have much higher levels of arabinose than, say, in neurotypical individuals of the same or similar age. And that's what this article from Dr. Shaw had showed many years ago. It's not that you and I maybe don't have some arabinose, but it's just that the autistic kids tend to have a lot more of it. And I've often felt they tend to be much more neurologically sensitive to these yeast toxins, leading to some of the behavioral problems. So if we think of autism, what are some of the classic indicators that yeast may be a problem? Well, sugar and carbohydrate cravings. Well, I wouldn't say that's always specific to yeast. I mean, most kids like sugar and carbohydrates. The same thing could be said in adults. Okay, so that's not 100% specific just for autism. But anxiety, emotional instability, I've seen that in some adults. Sensory-seeking behavior, that is leans more towards the special needs kids. And then sometimes you get this strange behavior, seeking pressure or heightened seeking of masturbation with some kids. That's not real common, but that can be an indicator that yeast is a problem. The thing that was really kind of classic, though, is that silliness, goofiness, giddiness, inappropriate laughter, this drunken behavior. And some parents have actually commented that they feel like their kids are drunk. Well, we can certainly see where that could be the case, because through the metabolism of glucose, they can output ethanol, alcohol. And then symptoms of improvement are also seen. Okay, so you would expect if somebody had elevated Candida that they would have improvements in bowel symptoms if the Candida was leading to that, or improvements in self-stimulatory behavior if the Candida was leading to that. Same thing with focus, concentration, and language problems too. But it's not all about the kids, okay, because Candida can be a pervasive problem for many individuals. And this was an old paper that back in 1989 where they were looking at common symptoms of individuals with chronic fatigue syndrome who had improvement when they were treated for Candida. And the things that show up are very interesting. Okay, impaired memory, sleep problems, depression, okay, all kind of leaning more towards the brain and nervous system. Balance problems, again, leads more towards the nervous system. Frequent urination is interesting because I have seen in some of the kids where they have increased potty accidents, so to speak. But also in adults, that can happen with chronic yeast as well. This probably, with the frequent urination, links into the discussion about oxalates, which we'll talk about here shortly. Okay, so again, reason number one, yeast detection, and then being able to take it deeper and apply that clinically and understand some of the complexities of yeast. Reason number two to do the organic acid test is to absolutely detect for the presence of Clostridia bacteria. Now, there are a lot of different types of Clostridia. Not all of them are toxic or pathogenic. Certainly Clostridia botulinum can be, or Clostridium tetani. And we'll talk a little bit about Clostridium difficile here as well. Now, if we focused on difficile Clostridia, and we think about purely from a GI standpoint, this was an information that came out this past year in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was talking specifically about data up to, what was it, 2011, right? 2011, with regards to deaths secondary to Clostridia difficile infections, and the numbers are very, very, very large, over 29,000 deaths. And they figure about between 10 to 30% of people who have C. diff will have at least one recurrence of their infection after treatment. So approximately 20%. That's pretty large. And so we're talking a lot of people have recurrence rates secondary to Clostridia. And the thing about Clostridia difficile, in Clostridia bacteria in general, is it's a difficult bacteria to get rid of because, like yeast, it can exist in different states. It forms these spores which are resistant to the antibiotics, and it makes the whole thing more complex. Now, there are certain strains of C. difficile that produce certain toxins, toxin A and B specifically. Now, these things would be more detected off of a stool sample. But it's these two toxins that's the main virulence factor related to C. diff's damage within the gut, causing mucosal damage along the lining of the digestive tract that leads to inflammation. Now, in some cases, it's just Clostridia difficile associated diarrhea, and in more severe circumstances, you get what's called the pseudomembranous colitis. And it turns out that toxin A and B are both capable of causing this mucosal damage. Now, when you do the organic acid test, you are not evaluating for toxin A and B. That would have to be done off of a stool sample. The damaging aspects of toxin A and B is directly at the lining of the gut. Okay, it can not only obliterate the microvilli, but it really causes massive epithelial cell damage, villi damage. You get tight junction disruption, swelling, inflammation. It's a nasty thing. And in real severe cases, you get this pseudomembrane or this pseudomembranous colitis, and these are these inflammatory membranes that are overlying areas of lesions in the bowel. But the story gets a little bit deeper when it comes to Clostridia. There are other toxins that Clostridia can produce that are beyond the effects on the gut. This is an interesting paper by Dr. Shaw. You can actually get this from the Great Plains website. So if you go into the Resource Center, go under Articles, you'll be able to find this. And this is specifically talking about a case of an individual who had extremely high levels of a Clostridia-related toxin that was triggering acute schizophrenia, an acute psychotic episode. We'll talk more about HPA here with chemically in a second. Well, it turns out that a lot of kids with special needs also have elevated HPA. And so just like the arabinose that seems to be more highly represented in the autism group, well, it turns out HPA is very much the same way. Okay, and so this graph almost mirrors that of arabinose. As I mentioned before, the properties of Clostridia are complex. It's a difficult organism, a difficult bacteria. It's a strict anaerobe, which means it likes to live in an environment where there's not a lot of oxygen. And there's different strains of pathogenicity. Clearly, tetanus and botulism are really severe. It also forms these spores, and these spores are highly resistant to heat, and they're highly resistant to antibiotics. And so when you talk about treating Clostridia, and we go through this through some of the webinars and the online courses that I do, is that many times you have to do this cyclical approach to the treatment. You can't just treat it for 10 days or 14 days and call it quits. You actually have to come back and repeat your dosing over time. And it takes some knowledge to kind of understand how to do that. But we know it works because we can see the numbers drop and we can see the clinical improvement in individuals. If we orient ourselves to the organic acid test and just look at the bacterial section, and we're specifically talking about Clostridia bacterial markers. Now, there's nothing elevated on this particular slide, but the two things that I primarily look at are number 16, which is HPA, and number 17, which is 4-creosol. Turns out 4-creosol is produced as well by Clostridia difficile. HPA, interestingly enough, one of the Clostridia that can produce HPA is Clostridia botulinum. So it's possible that when you do an organic acid test and find an elevated HPA, that could indicate the presence of botulinum. It just may be at a lower level and certainly not a level that's lethal. A couple other things that show up: 4-hydroxyphenylacetic acid. Okay, that can also be produced by C. difficile. This one, interestingly enough, has been linked to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, I'm not saying that the presence of it absolutely defines small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, but it certainly is an indicator of a need to maybe look a little bit deeper. And then periodically we'll get some of these other markers that are elevated that can just indicate some dysbiosis in the gut. So what's the big deal then about specifically the HPA and the 4-creosol? Well, it has to do with the those two toxins' ability to adversely impact certain neurochemicals throughout the body, specifically dopamine. Because as you'll see here, we have 4-creosol that comes from Clostridia difficile, and we have HPA, which can be produced by different strains of or different species of Clostridia. They both can inhibit this dopamine beta hydroxylase, and that causes a dopamine imbalance, many times causes the dopamine to become elevated, and we start to get a drop in norepinephrine and epinephrine, which can impact attention and focusing, etc. And that's what this slide represents. When we're looking at the functionality of these neurochemicals, there's always an overlap. Okay, so serotonin, we know, can help with mood and cognitive function. Well, so can dopamine, and so can norepinephrine. We know that dopamine and serotonin can also help with appetite and help with, sexual impulses. We certainly know that dopamine and norepinephrine can help with attention. So you create an imbalance in one neurochemical, you start to create imbalances in others. So again, it's not just an autism thing or an ADHD thing. It's for people who have mental health challenges or cognitive issues, etc. So the test has much more applicability than just a select group of individuals. Well, if we start to, for example, alter dopamine levels, well, what's the big deal? Well, there's a number of things that can happen. And what we're picking up off the organic acid test that indicates this is this excess production of something called homovanillic acid, HVA, and that is the byproduct of dopamine production. Well, it turns out that excess dopamine can cause stress at the cellular level. One, too much dopamine can actually cause in an overexposed state, brain cells to die. It can also cause a lot of oxidative stress, and anytime you generate oxidative stress, you're putting a strain on the body's antioxidant reserves and then potentially triggering inflammation. And in one part, you can also start to put a strain on the body's glutathione production. And we know that glutathione is that powerful, very important antioxidant that our cells need to function appropriately and also to be protected against toxicity. The other thing that happens is that dopamine starts to infiltrate itself into the pathways where norepinephrine would normally be functioning. Well, that can often lead to this fight or flight picture, this overstimulated type of scenario. And so particularly in this sympathetic side of the equation, think of the sympathetics like the accelerator in the nervous system and the parasympathetics the brake. Okay, it's a simplistic way, but there's a balance that has to happen. Okay, it's not all one or the other, and they all have a function in maintaining homeostasis throughout the body. But as you start to push on the accelerator more and more and more and rev the engine more and more and more, that can create havoc throughout the body metabolically, and certainly throughout the brain and nervous system. And by the way, all of that in some people can be triggered because of the presence of Clostridia. One other thing about Clostridia, and we go through this in great depth in other discussions, but it can also produce chemicals itself, just like Candida, that disrupts mitochondrial function. So this is what this slide is indicating, is Clostridia producing this particular acid, and it gets converted. It's taking certain chemicals for itself, and then it gets infiltrated into that Krebs cycle, and it starts to disrupt the production of this chemical called NADH. And remember, when I talk about NADH, that's the switching mechanism in this mitochondrial factory that helps to stimulate for the production of ATP, that cellular currency that we all need. So now we've shown that yeast can do it, Clostridia can do it, and so we started to really impact upon cellular metabolism. One of the interesting things about using the organic acid test as a an analysis for toxicity is sometimes the dramatic changes that can be seen clinically when you start to treat these organisms. And this is just a particular slide from my practice where we notice that not only is the HP high, very high, but the 4-creosol is also very high. From a priority treatment standpoint, in my view, Clostridia takes priority over yeast. And that's not to say that you wouldn't treat yeast, but one of the things I've seen clinically over the years is you've got to get after the Clostridia before you can hope to ever get yeast under control. And you can do sometimes these things simultaneously. In this particular case, there was a botanical protocol that was put in place that in about a 6-week period of time, we took the test in this particular individual where they had very high levels of Clostridia markers as well as yeast, and the markers normalized. Okay, so one of the courses that I go through in the Autism Mastery course, where I teach how to do this in a number of case examples, and then we also have a GI Mastery course that's also part of our online academy as well. I'll talk about that near the end of the lecture. Okay, so reason number 3. Now it comes down to prioritizing treatment of yeast and or Clostridia bacteria. I kind of gave away that reason number 3 just before I showed this slide. But to me, it comes down to really try to deal with as best you can, the bacteria issues first. So let's take sort of a classic autistic child, very sensitive child, behaviorally with regards to these toxins. So in the yeast behavior example, and again, these are sort of, I guess you'd call these more textbook. A lot of times not everybody has all of this stuff going on. But the yeast behaviors tend to be more stemmy, more silly, goofy, giddy, sugar cravings, irritability sometimes, heightened, self-stimulatory behavior. Clostridia behavior often is kind of opposite. You get more agitated, more aggressive, sometimes biting, kicking, screaming, sometimes in severe cases head banging. So they're kind of a little bit polar opposites. But in some cases you get a blending of the two, because you can have both Candida and Clostridia going at the same time. So, what's doing what? Well, let me go through a case example, okay, of this as far as this Clostridia-induced behavioral problems. So this was a child, age 5, at the time of the first visit, was diagnosed autistic, and from a developmental history, no pregnancy complications, maybe a little bit of colic as an infant, but overall, typically developed up to about 10 months. And parents, noticed that didn't have a lot of need for physical contact, but there wasn't anything else that was real stand out to them. That was a real problem. Breastfed for the first year, then began cow dairy and some solids around 6 months, pretty typical stuff. And then right around 10 to 11 months, the child's eye contact started to disappear, but was still engaged playfully, was engaging with the siblings, so nothing else really going on. Physical milestones were okay, and was even starting to babble, but never really sort of went beyond that. And about 15 months, parents notified the pediatrician of their concern regarding language. They were encouraged to wait a little bit longer and just kind of see, how things would go. Well, like a lot of these kids, there's a lot of ear infections. So multiple ear infections during the first 2 years, and of course they're given antibiotics. The parents felt like, he was on this merry-go-round, so to speak, of antibiotics. Hard stools during the first year and second year, and sometimes they needed to use suppositories, to kind of help resolve that problem. And then things started to kind of turn, okay? Child was ill, was given some Tylenol, no antibiotics were given, but overall they just kind of had this intestinal issue. And then afterwards, with the onset of fever and diarrhea, there was sort of more irritability and agitation that started to come about, and his appetite started to change. At about 20 months, it seemed to disappear, and there was just no more expressive language, poor social interaction, and at this point, the child became less interested with siblings in the neighborhood, and the kids in the neighborhood. Started also having some self-stimulatory behavior, side glancing, and other kind of odd behavior, hand flapping, finger twisting, etc. So parents did their due diligence, got some evaluations, and they did some genetic testing. Not much showed up. Eventually, the child was diagnosed autistic. So the parents did some biomedical intervention, did a casein-free diet, did a gluten-free diet, didn't see a whole lot there, started some supplements. The supplements, the multivitamin made them hyper, so they stopped that. And then for the most part, for the next year, just things seemed to stabilize a little bit with regards to his autism and his physical health. So around, age 4 or so, he developed an upper respiratory infection, and as you can imagine, he got some antibiotics. And within a week or so after treating that, this was when he was inconsolable, okay? Screaming, hitting, scratching, biting. This behavior went on and off for quite a while, for about 2 weeks or so. And then it disappeared a little bit, never fully went away. So the parents did some herbal remedies on their own. Tried some grapefruit seed extract, tried some caprylic acid. It seemed to help a little bit. Okay, so an organic acid test done, and it shows not only high arabinose, but very high Clostridia. What's interesting in this particular case is that his dopamine levels are not excessively high, and sometimes that will happen. That's why each test has to be applied clinically in practice, because remember, you're getting a snapshot in time with any given test that you do. But behaviorally, certainly manifesting with Clostridia behavior. Another little hook here is that his oxalic acid levels are high. We'll talk about oxalates here in a second. So we treated with some antibiotics, did some nystatin therapy, and did some Culturel as a probiotic in this particular case. And by the way, I mean, this particular lecture isn't meant to be in-depth analysis of all the different types of treatments that can be done. It's more of an overview of what the oat is useful for. What was interesting is that 5 days into the flagell treatment, his aggression irritability disappeared. So we knew that Clostridia was causing a problem, even though at that time the dopamine levels weren't necessarily in excess. And then within 3 weeks, he's happy, content, and playful. Okay, so I had recommended, because one of the things we see too was the elevation of the oxalate foods, and there are other examples of high oxalate types of cases that we go through in other presentations. In this particular case, I never knew if they actually did the oxalate diet or not. I hope so. I mean, I'm assuming they did fine because they've kind of lost a follow-up. But what this particular case sort of shows is that you really is the trigger for Clostridia can really be a problem with regards to behavior. And the organic acid test is excellent at detecting both. You can't just rely on stool testing, because the stool testing oftentimes is not specific enough with regards to what kind of Clostridia you're dealing with, and it doesn't assess for these particular toxins. Also, the classic thing with stool testing that the organic acid test has an advantage over is it's more common than not to have a stool test come back negative for Candida, even though it's there, because when you correlate it with an organic acid test in the same patient, you'll often find that the arabinose levels are high, but the stool culture is normal. And that's not that there's a problem with the lab doing the stool test, it's just the complex nature of Candida. Okay, reason number 4, okay, evaluating for high oxalates. This is another big topic, but it's very important to understand clinically because 2 primary things can drive oxalates. 1, diet, to yeast. So the organic acid test can give you an idea about yeast, and then of course you can inquire about diet. And there are some other markers that can show up on the organic acid test that may indicate problems with regards to oxalate metabolism. Vitamin B6, for example. Now, oxalates are a big problem. This is just a slide in severe case of an oxalate stone causing massive destruction within the kidney. But you can get oxalates elsewhere. Oxalate in the brain. This is oxalate crystals forming in the membranes, the meninges that surround the brain. And you can even get oxalate accumulation in the thyroid. So you can think about how that might disrupt thyroid function in patients. Also, the organic acid test evaluates for a couple other markers, glyceric and glycolic, which can be indicators of more metabolic imbalances that could contribute to high oxalate levels. And in some cases, the oxalate levels can come back very, very high. This is just an example of a test out of my practice. I do some consulting work for a group out of China where I see a lot of these organic acid tests that come to me from kids. And this is the highest marker I've ever personally seen at over 2,000. And I don't know the history on this particular individual, but I'm thinking with, out of China, it's likely, I know it's a food consumption issue because the yeast level is normal. We know it's not a genetic problem because the glyceric and glycolic markers, number 20 and 21, are glyceric and glycolic. So it's likely food, and I'm figuring something that could cause the oxalate levels to be that high would be soy and soy consumption. So what are some of the clinical scenarios? Well, sandy and grainy stools, more common in kids. Bladder irritability, that certainly can happen in kids and adults. Pain with urination, urethral pain, vulvar pain in women. So vaginal pain in women can be linked to a high oxalate type condition. Fibromyalgia, tendon pain, muscle discomfort, trigger point tenderness, a lot of things to consider with regards to the whole oxalate discussion. A couple interesting things though with regards to oxalates that you can track over time. This was some slides of a particular individual from my practice who at least initially presented in this bacterial Clostridia type behaviors, irritable, self-injurious, just very, very agitated. And initially there wasn't a lot that showed up. Okay, the Clostridia markers tended to be normal, even though the child actually responded pretty well to anti-Clostridia treatment. But eventually Clostridia markers did start to show up and actually were persistent and disappeared and came back and disappeared and came back, over time. My suspicion in this particular case is that there's some underlying inflammatory bowel problem happening, which honestly is difficult to assess with some of these kids. But the other thing that showed up in this particular case was high oxalates. And the high oxalates were always there. It's just that the initiation of a low oxalate diet was not feasible for the family at that time. But the child still actually got good benefit from treating Clostridia. But it wasn't until the oxalates were being addressed, as you'll notice here, as these levels start to come down, 241, 234, 223, and then eventually coming down to 185 and 127. Now, what was interesting in this particular scenario, and it didn't show up here on the slide, but notice that the level is 85, but it shows up high. Well, what happened in this particular case is when the test was submitted, they accidentally listed the age of the child as an 85-year-old man, which changed the reference range. On the organic acid test, there's different reference ranges for male, female, less than 13 years of age, and greater than 13 years of age. So it skewed the results, showing it to be elevated, but in actuality, it was the best looking value yet. And he was actually responding clinically that way too, actually doing much better. High oxalate foods, the primary players are things like spinach and soy products, but nuts, including nut milks and butters, berries, berry juice and jams can also lead to high oxalates too. Remember, off the organic acid test, most of the time what you're dealing with is a food-induced problem, and then secondary to that would be a yeast-induced problem of oxalates. Those are the two primary ones that seem to correlate clinically in practice. A couple other things on oxalates, though, that are interesting. In that oxalates can also bind minerals and bind to heavy metals in the body. And it turns out that oxalates have a very aggressive nature at binding to mercury and then becoming what's called insoluble, meaning that they don't like to come out of solution once they've bound and become this mercury oxalate salt. So the oxalate discussion as part of a training module is important with regards to sort of overall intervention for individuals. But when you're talking about what are the primary players and what are the things that tend to drive the problems, again, it comes down to diet and yeast. And so an oxalate program really revolves around that. If yeast isn't present off the organic acid test, it doesn't make much sense in trying to treat for it. But you can still do a low oxalate diet, and you can start to implement other supplements. Calcium and magnesium citrate to help bind the oxalates in the gut, probiotics to kind of help break down oxalates in the digestive system, and then things like vitamin B6, and there are some other supportive supplements as well. This was an interesting, some slides that just came up recently in my practice. And this was another child actually who had, elevated yeast and also had elevated oxalates. So this is back in January of last year. So we're about a year ago. Okay, so watch what happens. And what we did was we did a very basic program. We did some antifungal herbs, and then we put an oxalate program. Did the calcium, magnesium with meals, did some probiotics, and the parents implemented a low oxalate diet. So this was January. And then March of that year came back. And let's see, notice that, okay, the oxalates were 291. And then the oxalates started to come up a bit, okay? But the arabinose is coming down. Sometimes you'll get, when the oxalates are coming out, as the body's if you go on a low oxalate diet, the body will start dumping oxalates. So you may be doing a test and catching it at a time when there's higher oxalates being spilled. Okay, the arabinose comes down even more at 79. And then, in June, it's 252. And then finally in December, just about 3 weeks ago or so, the arabinose is normal and the oxalate is normal. So a really nice sort of time frame of actually showing you that these things do and can improve. Reason number 5, okay, go back to the mitochondria, and that is the organic acid test gives us some insight into mitochondrial function. Now again, the mitochondria are these little factories in our cells that produce this chemical called ATP, which is our cellular energy currency. And there have been a host of things that have been shown that can affect mitochondria. Environmental chemicals, for example, pesticides or PCB, other types of things, heavy metals, even vaccine reactions in some people. And then other types of stressors, just imbalances in other biochemistry, nutritional imbalances, all can lead to mitochondrial problems. And now you also know from this talk that Clostridia toxins and yeast toxins can as well. And so we're just talking about the measuring and analyzing these different chemicals from the organic acid test. And it gives so the organic acid test gives an indication of mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, one of the reasons I'm talking about this is that in the vast majority of cases, what we're dealing with from a mitochondrial dysfunction standpoint is secondary to other problems. It's not a primary problem per se. It's not to say that it couldn't be. But more common than not, the mitochondria function is being impaired because of yeast, because of Clostridia, or because of oxalates, for example. That's a very common scenario. And then again, when you start to disrupt mitochondrial function, you disrupt this chemical called NADH. And NADH is important because it goes into this other chamber, so to speak, this other pathway to produce ATP. And this is a better picture of that. Okay, so here's our mitochondria. Here we're producing NADH, and then NADH fits right here in this other compartment to produce ATP. Reason number 6, and that is to specifically be able to evaluate certain neurotransmitter imbalances. We talked before about dopamine and HVA and norepinephrine and VMA, or as two byproducts of those chemicals. So HVA is linked to dopamine, VMA is linked to epinephrine and norepinephrine. And again, we need an adequate balance. So what happens is that dopamine is converted to norepinephrine by that specific enzyme called dopamine beta hydroxylase, which can, at least one thing that can do it, be inhibited by Clostridia toxins. HPA and 4-creosol, there's a misspelling there, but that can cause dopamine levels to go up. Okay, these things can also manifest in to be elevated in some cases of other chronic infections or food sensitivities or fear, anxiety, hyperactivity might also drive these chemicals up as well. So here's that slide again. Okay, so from a organic acid standpoint, we can measure creosol and we can measure HPA and see if it's impacting upon this dopamine beta hydroxylase enzyme. Okay, so here we have, what do we have here? We've got creosol. Okay, so in this slide we've got creosol that's elevated, and we can see that the dopamine byproduct is really high. Okay, so we know that that enzyme's being affected. Here's an individual with depression. Okay, look at the HPA level, over almost 1,000. And their HVA level is also very high. And then after treatment, usually in these cases, by the way, these come from, this particular site comes from Dr. Shaw at Great Plains. They're usually using antibiotics, but there's other botanicals that can help too. The HVA level normalizes, and so does the depression. I know I'm going through this kind of quickly, but again, kind of give you an overview of the usefulness of this test. Reason number 7, being able to evaluate for serotonin imbalances and then also quinolinic acid. And this is a complicated talk, and we, through the one-day oat seminars that I do with Great Plains around the country, we spend an entire lecture on this whole point, and I also go through this in depth through my online courses as well. But the gist of it is this. We need tryptophan, okay, as an amino acid to help propel the serotonin pathway. And we need serotonin obviously to help with mood and focus and attention and sleep, because serotonin eventually, part of it becomes melatonin for sleep. But tryptophan can also enter another pathway. And that other pathway will eventually produce something called quinolinic acid. Now that's not a bad thing if the levels are normal, because quinolinic acid can also help produce the substrate to help with mitochondrial activity for ATP production. The problem is when quinolinic acid is too high, it can become a stressor to the nervous system, to the brain and nervous system, kind of similar like dopamine is. Well, it turns out that there are a number of things that can trigger or pull on tryptophan's entry into the quinolinic acid pathway and not go down the serotonin pathway. And one of those is chronic infections. Candida, bacteria, viruses can do it. So again, it's a complicated talk, but one of the things that we do off the organic acid test is to evaluate whether quinolinic acid levels are high or are the serotonin levels low. This is a really, kind of a complicated slide here as well. But if we just sort of follow along and let's look, here's our tryptophan. And again, a lot of it wants to go into the serotonin side of the equation. But some of it naturally is going to flow down to this state of quinolinic acid. And that can have a beneficial thing. One of the things is again, it produces this chemical called NADH. It says NAD, but essentially NADH, and that's that substrate that gets utilized in this mitochondrial mechanism to make ATP. But too much quinolinic acid, if there's too much of it, it becomes toxic. So there's a tight regulatory control over these types of things. Let me go back here real quick. Great Plains just released a test in the past couple months called a toxicity screen, okay, the GPL tox. I don't have a slide for it here. But I want you to take a look at this mechanism right here. So here's our quinolinic acid, and here's where it wants to go, is to NAD, okay, to be utilized by the Krebs cycle. Well, in the presence of a chemical called phthalate, that mechanism or that reaction can be blocked. Phthalates are very common in our environment. They're used in cosmetics. They can be found in plastics and rubber. They can be found in the home. We're all exposed potentially to phthalates, just that some people accumulate them at a higher level. One of the things that I'm seeing starting to come in off that GPL tox test is that there are certain people who are harboring a number of these different chemicals, which not only can affect quinolinic acid levels, but also affect mitochondrial levels. So that's an interesting test to do as a piece to sort of add into your information here with regards to the organic acid test. Some additional reasons. Let's wrap up 8, 9, and 10. Okay. Reason number 8 is folate metabolism. Now, we could spend an entire seminar on the whole methylation cycle and MTHFR. I mean, it could be endless. But the organic acid test does a pretty good job at picking up on 2 markers, uracil and thiamine. Most of the time when this section is imbalanced, it's the uracil that's high, and that indicates either a deficiency of folate or some problem in folate metabolism. And that's important because we know that folate is very important in the methylation cycle. It's very important for brain development, for attention and focusing. They use folate as a supplement for some cases with people with depression. I typically am not seeing levels at the level where you'd be concerned about a genetic disease. It's more sort of functional imbalances that just indicate the need for supplementation. But it kind of helps point the discussion, so to speak, in that direction of maybe looking to do some more things from a methylation standpoint. And then there are some other reasons, evaluating for various nutritional markers, and there's a lot of them. So the organic acid test has a section of nutritional markers. Methylmalonic acid is one marker that when it is elevated can indicate a deficiency of B12. Ascorbic acid, vitamin C, is often found to be low in people. Pyridoxic acid, which is vitamin B6, that one's commonly low. It's particularly low in people who tend to have high oxalate types of conditions. I see it low quite a bit. Pantothenic acid is another marker that can indicate the need for additional B vitamins. A lot of times you'll see that abnormal in people who have adrenal insufficiencies. And then there's a few other things that the nutritional markers section will look at. CoQ10, which isn't as imbalanced as you would think, but it does show up abnormal from time to time. Biotin shows up fairly rarely, but it's an important nutrient. Biotin can be helpful in preventing against invasive yeast. It's also helpful in high oxalate type conditions as well. And so here's that section, right? So we've got nutritional markers. One thing to keep in mind with the organic acid test, when you look at this, it can be a little confusing at first, is that the markers that are asterisked, so 50, 53, 55, and 57, they have an asterisk next to them. When the marker is elevated, it means there's a deficiency of that nutrient. So it's kind of reversed. So for example, I saw an organic acid test earlier today that had an elevated biotin. I remember I just told you that it doesn't show up very common. Well, it happened to show up today. So the biotin was, I think it was around 2.4. So, or the methyl citric, excuse me, was about 2.4. So there's a deficiency of biotin. The ones that are not asterisked, okay, so that'd be 51, 52, 54, and 56, indicated deficiency when the levels are low. So it's common, you tend to see vitamin C's, ascorbic acid's low, and ascorbic acid gets metabolized very quickly in the body. So it's not uncommon to see that low. I didn't mention anything here about the fatty acid section. This is another thing that the organic acid helps to pick up on, and certainly can indicate maybe there's a problem in metabolizing fats. Most of the time, that section is either manipulated by diet, so people who are using coconut oil in their food or taking something called medium chain triglycerides, it might show up elevated in that section. But they're often elevated. Some of these are slightly elevated in the presence of bacteria and yeast. So a lot of times what you'll find is when you hit on the primary things off the oat, so the yeast, the Clostridia, the oxalates, and you kind of work at from a dietary standpoint, a lot of times these other markers will often improve on their own. And then finally, reason number 10, okay, for the organic acid test and applying this to different types of individuals is be able to assess for the potential of toxicity such as glutathione production or inborn errors of metabolism. Let's look at that. So the last page of the organic acid test looks at glutathione markers. Notice that these are asterisked as well. So a high value indicates that there is a deficiency of glutathione. The one that most commonly shows up when it's abnormal is the pyroglutamic. So if that is elevated, it's indicating we've got a glutathione deficiency problem. Number 61, you'll see that fairly commonly, usually about this range when it's elevated. A lot of times that correlates back to a bacterial problem, so you can kind of go back and look at that section. Sometimes salicylate foods may cause it to be high. If somebody was taking aspirin or acetaminophen or aspartame, that might cause it to be slightly high too. These amino acid metabolites, they're really there to pick up on serious metabolic disorders. Those are pretty rare. Sometimes these can be manipulated too by maybe environmental chemicals or yeast bacteria as well. So if you're seeing some things show up there, I think that GPL tox test is certainly worth doing. But again, I don't want to say it never happens, but for an individual to show up with a severe metabolic disorder that would be found is in my experience, not all that common, but that part of the test is there. And then the phosphoric, and this is kind of interesting. Let me see what, okay, I already talked about that. Let me just skip ahead real quick. Yeah, let me go back. Okay. So the phosphoric section. So we talked about the markers for glutathione. And we talked about this 2-hydroxyhyperic, which is commonly seen with bacteria or certain food exposure. The phosphoric is interesting in that you will commonly find it low to low normal. Now in this particular case, it's high. High values are commonly seen with what's called metabolic acidosis. Okay, that would be things that would be driven by people eating a lot of toxic food, high levels of bacteria or yeast imbalances. I mean, there could be some other serious metabolic issues, but the vast majority of times it's pretty straightforward stuff. So that might cause the phosphoric levels to go high. Another thing that could cause phosphoric acid levels to go high is drinking a lot of soda pop, okay, that has phosphoric acid in it. But more times than not, you'll see low values. And often it's linked to a need for additional vitamin D. Let me see if I put that in here. Yeah, here it is, okay? And I'm starting to accumulate these now because one of the things I try to do in my practice is get people to start doing more vitamin D testing. So this is just one representation. This was actually a child out of China where they're starting to do the vitamin D test. So here we have low phosphoric acid and our vitamin D levels are low. Ideally, we'd like to be between 40 and 80, somewhere up around 50. So that's one thing to consider for yourself, your child, or in your practice, is start to run the vitamin D levels, the vitamin D test more frequently, particularly if the phosphoric acid levels are abnormal. Okay, so a lot of stuff I went through, I realized that, and again, if you had posted some questions, those questions will come to me. They'll come to me from the organizer at Great Plains, who's going to be holding the recording, and then sending those emails to me, and I'll respond usually within a couple days. Some people don't have access to this type of testing. So if you're a practitioner where you can order this testing in your office, that's great. People sometimes in other countries can order some of the labs on their own. But if you don't have access to these labs, there's actually a website that we have called labtestplus.com. And labtestplus.com is we actually carry a lot of these test kits. We carry a lot of these tests or access to the tests. We don't carry the test kits. But they can be ordered through this website. So you can actually order an organic acid test, for example, from Great Plains through labtestplus.com. And the results are sent to us, and then what we do is provide a written interpretation on the results. And then that information is sent to you. So there's a whole list of labs that are available at LabTest Plus. You just go to labtestplus.com, and we have labs from Great Plains. We have labs from BioHealth Laboratory, Doctor's Data, ZRT, etc. Also, if you are a parent or a caregiver of a child with autism and you want to interact with me, even on a daily basis, and just post questions to me or brainstorm ideas with me, we've had this website in existence now for 5 or 6 years at autismactionplan.com. And there's a forum, there are videos, there's protocols, there's articles. The place that most people utilize off this site is the forum, and there's actually a place on this site for private messaging. And I'm on this site on a daily basis answering questions. So it's a membership site, it's $37 a month, and if that's something that is of interest to you. I had mentioned during this presentation that I have been involved in online education, not only through the webinars of Great Plains, but things that I've been developing on my own. This past year, in 2015, we launched the Autism Mastery course, which was a 12-week course on the fundamentals of foundational intervention and testing for autism. These are courses and lectures that are specific to health practitioners, but parents with autistic kids can certainly, join these courses as well. We then launched something called GI Mastery, which was a 9-week course about learning how to integrate the organic acids test with stool testing. We also talked about small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, Helicobacter pylori parasitic infections as well. And then we're going to be releasing or launching an adrenal mastery course coming up here shortly. I'll have some dates for you as well. I'm currently in the middle of doing the autism mastery course. Again, it's now gone from a 12-week course to a 16-week course. Very in-depth, tremendous amount of information, and that currently is in the process now. We're about 8 weeks into that, so we're about halfway through that course. And we'll be redoing this course again starting late spring. I think we're putting together some dates now, so probably late spring 2016. So some new courses that we have launching pretty soon. So starting February 2nd, we have the GI Mastery course, which again is that course learning how to take the organic acid test information, correlate it clinically in practice, along with stool testing, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, parasitic infections, Helicobacter pylori, etc. So that starts on February 2nd. We're also going to be launching a course called Practice Marketing and Profitability. This is teaching practitioners about how to improve their visibility online and do different things in their practice to just improve the efficiency in practice, and that'll be starting in middle of February. And then a course that I'm actually very interested in is the Adrenal Mastery. So this is everything about adrenal testing, adrenal fatigue, adrenal problems, learning how to do salivary testing, and applying that in practice in different ways. So if these are of any interest to you or to get on our email list, you can always go to integrativemedicineacademy.com for upcoming courses and then sort of a schedule of when things will be happening. And then finally, if you're interested in consulting with me or beyond maybe just posting questions to the Autism Action Plan site, this is my contact information, info@mysunrisecenter.com, and our phone number as well. So I hope that was useful information for you on the use of the organic acids test. Again, if you posted questions, those questions will come to me from Great Plains, and I will answer those personally, sometime later this week. So with that, let's go ahead and close out the webinar for tonight, and we will see you next month for another installment of a Great Plains sponsored webinar.